In this video, I would like to explain how to configure single sign-on based on SAML in the Axway API Manager. To get started, I'm opening the official documentation. I'm actually using an API Manager 7.7 Service Pack 1, and the idea is to create a trusted relationship between my service provider, my API manager, and the identity provider, which is in my case a Keycloak. I have already configured some things in Keycloak to be prepared for that video. For instance, I have created a dedicated realm, which is named Axway and has the identifier Axway. I have also configured a user which I would like to use to test the single sign-on at the end. That user has a number of additional attributes I would like to map into the user skeleton in API Manager, like the department, like the description, phone, and so on, that kind of stuff. So the next thing I'm going to do together with you is to create a client. From the perspective of Keycloak, a client is that, let's say, that trusted relationship client, and that's why we are creating a new client and call that client the Axway API Manager. The protocol we are using is SAML. Okay, and now that client needs a number of settings. First, I already know that in order to work together with the API manager, we need to make sure that assertions are signed as well. So that's why that needs to be turned on. And additionally, I would like to map different attributes out of the users into the SAML response so that the API manager can take over that information into the internal user store. For that, I can go in Keycloak into the mappers feature, and here I can add individual attributes to be mapped to the outside. And to do that, I can create them manually, or let's do that manually. First, I would like to have an attribute which is called the full name, and that one should take over the user first name plus the user last name to have a complete full valid name, and that should go into the SAML attribute full name. And that's not all. Then I would like to have the attribute description to be exported, which is a normal user attribute out of Keycloak. Save that as well. And I would like to have the phone number exported, which is also phone, phone. And I would like to have that email exported. For that, I can use one of the built-ins, like the email I would like to have. And maybe there is something missing. Let me check based on the attributes. We have the department. I think the description is not yet part of it. Clients, API manager, mappers. The description is part, the department is missing. Okay, let's add the department as well, which is also a normal user attribute. And let's add it over here. Okay, now with that, whenever the the Keycloak is sending a SAML response to the client Axway API Manager, all those details will be exported into the SAML response as claims, and then the API Manager can read that and take it over into the internal user store using a mapping feature, and we come to that later. Okay, so now we are good to go. I would say almost good to go. A few things more later on in Keycloak, but let's go back. And now we need to configure single sign-on in the API Manager. And there's one important file that needs to be maintained. and needs to be made available to the API Gateway instance in that configuration folder. And to do that, I'm using the existing template, which is shipped with the product. And I copy that over from the samples folder, single sign-on, and there's a Keycloak, and the file is called serviceprovider.xml. And that goes into my actual instance configuration folder, instance 2, a group 2, instance 1, and then conf. And inside that service XML, service provider XML, I have to configure a few things. First of all, it is separated into two main sections, which is the service provider, which is our API manager. And this section is used to generate the SAML request, which is then sent to Keycloak. And in order to give Keycloak a chance to map or to identify from where that SAML request is coming, we have to make sure that the client ID matches to the entity ID, which is given here. And by intention, I used a client ID, which is not the same as the default. That SAML request needs to be signed, and in order to sign it, we need to have a private key, and we will generate that private key in a minute. And I already know that the password for the private key will be change.me, and the alias will be SSO key, so we are good with that. The next thing I need to do is when the SAML response comes back from Keycloak, we need to make sure that the SAML identity provider is known to our configuration. And for that reason, I have to configure that SAML identity provider entity here. And I have a DNS alias, which is Keycloak, keycloak.com on that port, which points to my local Keycloak instance. And I have to be careful that the realm is really the same as it is configured in Keycloak. And we have to do the same here. Just take that over. And in order to validate, I think it is a good idea to make sure that this guy here is really reachable. Let's go quickly in Firefox directly from the API Manager host. In a normal Word, then you would use something like curl to make sure that the API Manager can use or can download the meta URL you're configuring. One important note concerning that metadata URL. This is an HTTPS endpoint, and in order to successfully download the certificate and accept the client certificate, you have to provide, let's say, a trust store. And I'm super lazy, and I'm just saying, please use the same key store, and later on we will create a key store, and then I will put the certificate for my Keycloak into that key store as well. So, and that's why also for the trust store in that case, we will have the same password as it is the same key store. Okay, so that means we will trust all certificates in that key store, or let's say the ones we are marked to be trusted. So when the response comes back, then you have the capability to map attributes, information which are returned from the token or identity provider like Keycloak, and to create the user on the API manager in the way you want. And I have configured an attribute on the other side on Keycloak, which is named the department. And I think I have taken the department like this one here. And I want to have that all users from that department go into a user role administrator. And I'm saying that the organization within API Manager should be API development. So that means my expectation is when I'm logging in later on, I belong to the department preset Germany, which normally is something like a role, not something like an attribute, but a role mapping. Then that user goes into the organization API development. Additionally, I would like to map all the other attributes, and I have to make sure that the attribute names I'm using in Keycloak are really mapped into the attribute names in API Manager. And for that, this is documented in that section here, SSO mapping syntax. I have to make sure using the right things. And for that, I have something like a pre-existing copy where I have taken over, or where I have prepared to say, take the username from Keycloak and put it into the name in API Manager, use the full name attribute and put it into user full name, and so on and so forth. This is what I want to have. Okay, that's all I have to do here in that file. Of course, you could modify or remove all the other filter mapping templates, but for me, it's good to go. Save that. And now we have to really turn on single sign-on for the API Manager. And this is done by a servlet filter, which needs to be configured. And when scrolling down here, we have done already a few things, or let's continue before turning it on. Let's continue to create the 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 key and the certificate by using key tool with that example. So let me create my SSO JKS, and then I have an alias inside with my key, which is called the SSE key. The password I have to use now, as it is configured, is change me, my first name and last name. I'm working in pre-sales. I'm working at Axway. I assigned to Berlin, and the country is Germany, and all this is correct. And now I have single sign-on key JKS. And the thing which is not yet in place is to have that Keycloak certificate inside that JKS. And in order to do that, let me download that one here. More information, view the certificate. It's a self-signed certificate in my case. It's just part of the Docker container which has been created. And let me put it into the right folder. API Gateway, Groups, Group 2, Instance 1, Conf. And I call it my Keycloak cert. Save that, close, and close this as well. And now I do have my Keycloak, and now I need to add that one into the key store, and I would like to import the certificate. No, help to get the usage. And I would like to create an alias which is called my Keycloak, which is some kind of optional, but I do it anyway. The file I'm going to import is my Keycloak cert. The key password, or the store password, sorry, is change me. And the key store I'm going to import that certificate is the is the SSO JKS. Okay, and we would like to trust that certificate. And now we have that certificate trusted. Normally you would like to have, or you typically have either the identity provider part in an external file. When looking again into that file, you would normally, let's say, you have the option to say that the metadata URL is a local file instead of a remote endpoint, and then you can configure everything. Then you can skip that certificate validation part and you can completely remove that. But in that case, you need some kind of a trust store. Okay, So now this is done, and now we need to enable single sign-on. So that means we have used key tool. One more thing concerning the certificate. Of course, we are now signing our SAML request, which is sent to Keycloak, using that key we have just created, and we need to tell Keycloak this is, let's say, validate that, let's say, the client is really valid or the key is valid. And in order to do that, I'm going back to Keycloak, but I'm doing that directly here inside my virtual machine to make it easier to grab that file and go into the administration. And let's say this is the folder we would like to use, copy. And now we have to go into our client. So that means everything that comes from our API manager, which is saying I'm have a SAML request, needs to be signed with that key. And this is the default one Keycloak provides to us, but we have generated our own. And now I would like to import our own. So this is the SSO key, and the password of the key store is change.me, and the file is over here. That's pretty good. And I can go and say this one here. Open that file, import it. And now this certificate is used to validate that the SAML request is really valid. So I have to be sure to reload the external Keycloak here, just to make sure that we are not overwriting the SAML key again. So that means now this one has the same state. Okay, and now ultimately I would like to turn on, so we have done this, I would like to turn on single sign-on. We have specified the IDP, we have decided to use it by URL, and now we have to do a few things in Policy Studio. I have already opened my Policy Studio, and I have already configured that static file provider, which is relatively simple. It provides a single web page. This is what I have already done. You can see it here. I went to listeners, portal, path, and here I have said login field. This is what I have done. What I haven't done is I haven't added that servlet filter SSO binding feature over here. And this is what I'm going to do now. And I have to do that as per documentation on both API versions. I skipped the version 1.2 for now because to my knowledge it's not used anyway. But whoever is using that needs to add it also for the other one. And here inside that provider class names, I have to say there is an additional servlet filter SSO binding feature. The other thing I have to do is to configure our cross-site forgery protection filter to provide a whitelist, and that whitelist must contain our Keycloak URL. So that means I take that from here and say that login should now be okay. Say it like that. And now we have that whitelist in place, and we have, at the end, you have seen that single sign-on binding feature in place. That's besides that SSO login field. I think that's all we have to do. And now we should deploy that configuration. This is what I'm going to do now. And let me check the documentation. Yeah, now we have to configure these SAML endpoints in the IDP. And let me quickly do that. Go to the API Manager clients. And here we go and say the fine-grained SAML endpoints. And my API Manager is listening under API env. And I have to take over the other ones. this one here, and the other one is the same. So this is what I have to do as well. And in the meantime, the SAML configuration has been deployed in order to validate that single sign-on, or that this filter SSO binding feature is now activated. You can go into the API manager. I prefer for that to use a private window, and there's a dedicated URL now which you have to call, and this URL is now picked up by the filter. The filter is then looking or doing that SAML signed request to Keycloak and so on, and only with that filter in place that will happen. So now I'm redirected to Keycloak. I can log in now into Keycloak, and then I'm getting an internal error. Okay, that was not expected, but it's okay. Let's have a look into the traces, what happened, why we get that error. Let's look for the trace output of that gateway instance where we have turned on. And you see the received response is not valid, an error occurred, the assertion must be signed. Okay, that's something I have forgotten to configure in Keycloak. So I go back to client. So I think I have turned it on, but let's see. Signed assertions. Okay, turned it on. And now it is important to use a new browser window to create a new SAML request and get a new SAML response. New private window, 8075. Login again. And internal server error again. That's super great. Check what happened now. And not valid. Assertion must be, yeah, okay. Now I know what I'm doing wrong all the time in Keycloak, because it looks like that you're done with that, but you need to save that thing. I think I haven't done this a minute ago. Let me check if it is now working. 8075. Yeah, I have to use the right endpoint. Login. Now it's working. And now I'm logged in, and I can check my user profile, and I see that the information has been taken over, like my first name, my last name. This is the information we have combined with the JavaScript mapper, my email address, my imaginary phone number, and a description I have placed into that user attribute. And the good thing is now that I can use, let's say, the API manager exactly in the same way. And of course, there's also an application developer, that, let's say, kind of entity internally created, but I cannot change anything because it's externally managed. And if I log out, I'm not only logged out of the API manager. What happens when I click log out, then a signed SAML logout request is sent to Keycloak, and the user is really logged out of the Axway realm, or out of the Axway tenant, and then I have to relog in again, which I can do. And now I'm coming back to the API manager in the same way. So that was all I wanted to share and I wanted to show concerning configuration of single sign-on for API Manager in combination with Keycloak. Thanks for watching. I hope it was helpful.